Right now we want to talk about why Norway is the best country in the world. The Kingdom of Norway, they have a population of about 5.3 million, which is about the same population as Minnesota. I think it may be half the Norwegians are in Norway and half the Norwegians are in Minnesota. That's why it's split that way. Then the land area of 148,000 square miles is about the same size as Montana, although a very different shape. Montana, of course, is pretty much square, and we have this long coastline that runs north to south in Norway, with the largest part of it being in the south. We have the great blessing, I think, of being able to go all the way to the North Cape, the furthest north point of Norway on this trip. The government of Norway is a unitary parliamentary constitutional monarchy. You can tell me what that is. No, just kidding. Basically, their government is sort of like ours and sort of like England's. They have a king and queen, but the king and queen, like in England, are primarily symbolic. You know, they don't really have specific powers formally in the government. There are some things that they're turned to for, but they don't really have any power in it. It is primarily the executive branch. The king is a symbol, but then they have a prime minister and they have an executive council of ministers. That's the executive branch, much like what we have in the United States if you're from the States. Then they have a legislative or parliamentary branch, which passes the laws, much like the Congress does, or the Parliament in Great Britain. And then the third of their tripartite government is the judiciary. The judiciary is very important in Norway because it is seen as the balance, the one that is makes sure that we maintain an even balance between the executive branch and the legislative branches. And there's a great deal of trust placed in the legislative branch, the court systems, all the judiciary that they have in Norway. I'll talk about that a little bit. Norway, of course, if you look at the whole globe, is right up here in the corner. You know, right in the center, I guess. It's in the corner if you were someplace else, but up near the top. But in addition to this landmass, part of what we know as Scandinavia, they also have Jan Mayen Island, which is north of Iceland, that is part of Norway. And up here they have the Svalbard archipelago. The largest of the islands there, Spitsbergen, is one of the largest islands in the Arctic region. I'll talk about Spitsbergen because we're going to talk about the Svalbard seed vault in a few minutes. They, at one time, also controlled the Faroe Islands, Greenland, Iceland, the Shetland Islands, the Orkney Islands, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man. Much of that is because Norway, the Norwegian Vikings, went over into the areas around Scotland and down into Ireland, as we talked about the other day when we talked about Vikings. So they maintained control of that for a very long time. They no longer control the Faroes, Greenland, Iceland, etc. But interestingly, Norway, way up here, also claims part of the Antarctic, the other end of the planet. There is a large area called Queen Maud's Land that is claimed by Norway. And you go, how in the world does that work? Well, we'll talk about Arctic exploration later. Many of the explorers of both the Arctic here in the north and also the Antarctic were Norwegian. And so Norwegians were some of the early explorers that approached some of those areas. They actually have only claimed the Queen Maud Land since 2015, but it is considered part of Norway now. So not a big population. They don't even have bears down there, but that's which, you know, that's why it's called Antarctic. It means no bears, whereas the Arctic has bears. Yes.
Does the UN recognize that as part of Norway?
Yes. Most of Antarctic is kind of shared, and so they claim it. As much as anything else, what they're saying is we have responsibility for it, more than that there's an international agreement that there's no mining, there's no oil exploration, there's no trying to take advantage of any resources, although there are not a lot of resources down there other than ice. But so it's primarily that Norway is saying we will take responsibility if there's ever a problem, if there's ever a need. So there's not a difficulty with that. As I said, they are a monarchy. This is King Harald V and Queen Sonja. They have been the king and queen of Norway since 1991. The woman on the right here is Erna Solberg. She has been the prime minister since 2013. Since 2010, every year there's an International Democracy Index that rates countries based upon how democratic they are. And since 2010, Norway has been rated the #1 most democratic country in the world, meaning that the government is seen as being very transparent, having a great deal of integrity and accountability to the people, and there is a very high sense of the people of Norway that they can trust their government. And so this is the reason that the Democracy Index has identified them as being the most democratic. There is very little corruption, and the perception of the people in Norway is that their government has very little corruption. So this is all very positive in terms of the relationship between the government and of the people. It is a social democracy, which means the government owns a lot of the resources. About 30% of the gross national product is produced by government-owned organizations. You know, they control a lot of the utilities and things of that sort, but they represent the people in that, and the people are good with that. They don't have a difficulty with it. It's not like some of the countries, say Venezuela, where it's called a social democracy, but it really is a dictatorship. That's not at all the case here. This is considered the most democratic country in the world by many people. Reporters Without Borders, who evaluate countries based upon freedom of the press, have given Norway a shared first place in terms of the freedom of the press and freedom of expression. It ties with Iceland as the best country in the world for freedom of expression and of the press. Norway is also considered very progressive in their social laws. The protection of rights of women, of ethnic minorities, of the LGBT communities, and other ethnic groups. In fact, as far back as 1884, 171 major leading figures in Norway got together and they created an association, the Norwegian Association of Women's Rights. So back in the 19th century, they were actively advocating for women's rights to education, to suffrage, to work, and to other gender equality kinds of things. There is a huge focus on women, ethnic minorities, etc. in terms of their rights. Norway is a huge promoter of human rights and equality in many ways. The Norwegian prisons are considered very humane. And in fact, there's an emphasis on rehabilitation. Their recidivism rate, which means the percentage of people who get out of prison and then end up back in prison again, is 20%, which is the lowest in the world. So they have proven themselves much more effective with their humane prison system in helping people change and rehabilitate and not end up back in prison again. They abolished the death penalty generally in 1902, and then in 1974 they extended that so that even treason and war crimes are not, they don't have execution for those now either. And again, the prison system is highly regarded in terms of its effectiveness. That was sort of proven back in 2011, what they call in Norway the July 11th attacks. A 32-year-old right-wing radical named Anders Behring Breivik committed 2 acts of domestic terrorism in that one day. One, he had set a car bomb. It was a fertilizer and fuel oil bomb that he put in a van and parked in the government quarter of Oslo. It's the same kind of bomb, basically, that was used in the Oklahoma City attacks, if you're familiar with that, in the States. Well, when this exploded, 8 people were killed, 209 people were injured, and 12 were seriously injured. 2 hours later, because he wasn't present when the bomb went off, 2 hours later, he was dressed in a fake police uniform, and he went to a summer camp on Utoyd Island, and opened fire at this summer camp, killing 69 people, injuring 110 more, 55 of them seriously. Now I tell you all of that because this is a situation, it was the worst attack in Norway since World War II. It was estimated by the government that 1 in 4 Norwegians knew someone directly that was affected by these attacks. So it was a huge deal. I mean, it's sort of the 9/11 of Norway. All of it done by this one man. He was arrested, he confessed, he was found guilty and given a 21-year prison sentence, which is the longest prison sentence that you can get in Norway, but they have the condition that at the end of his term, if they determine that he is still a threat to society or that he it's a public danger to release him, he can have his sentence extended in 5-year periods. But the fact that the government of Norway, for this horrendous attack, treated him with toleration in this act of military, domestic terrorism and intolerance, they were given credit from around the world for how they responded to this in terms of fairness, of still seeking to rehabilitate him in prison, rather than doing something like reinstituting the death sentence just for him. And so Norway was given a lot of credit for that test to their whole judicial and their prison system. Financially, talk about some of the financial factors in Norway. Norway is the 3rd largest oil exporter in the world. We were just in Stavanger, and Stavanger is one of the centers for their oil industry. Only Russia and Saudi Arabia export more oil than Norway does, and it's 1/4 of their gross product, the value of it coming out of Norway. They are also rich in other resources like natural gas, hydropower, fish, forests, and minerals. They're the 2nd largest exporter of seafood after China in the whole world, and they have the world's 6th largest merchant fleet. So the sea is obviously critical to them in a lot of different ways. They also focus a lot on food processing, shipbuilding, metals, chemical, mining, and paper products. Interestingly, in paper products, just a few years ago, they passed a law to prevent deforestation, meaning there are strict limits put on how many of the trees you can cut down, and they have had to be very creative in finding out how to continue to meet some of their paper and bulk pulp processing kinds of things without deforesting. And so they've really led the way in a lot of those kind of ecological issues. Norway has the 2nd highest GDP, gross domestic product, in all of Europe after Luxembourg, and the 6th highest GDP per capita in the world. Norway is considered the 2nd wealthiest country in the world in terms of overall monetary value. They have the largest capital reserve per person in the whole world, and they are a net external creditor, meaning they don't borrow money, they loan money. They don't have any international debt to speak of. The public health care in Norway is free if you're under 16. When you turn 16, you have to start paying 2,000 kroner a year, which is $250. And after that, it's free. So they have universal coverage on health care. New parents, when they have a child, can take 46 weeks of paid leave. That's a legal requirement. At least 18 weeks of that can be taken by the father. So they try to balance that as well. And to give you a perspective, the United States is one of only 4 developed countries in the world that does not have a mandatory maternity leave program. We don't have federal laws that mandate that. They have 46 weeks of paid leave in Norway. Unemployment is 4.8%. 1/3 of the people approximately are employed by the government, because as I told you, the government runs a lot of the industry and things of that sort. It's been clearly demonstrated that the hourly productivity levels and the average hourly wage in Norway are the highest in the world. They get paid more and they are more productive than any other country in the world. The difference also, because they have a natural sort of egalitarian spirit, the difference between the lowest paid workers, the minimum wage, and the highest paid CEOs is far less than it is in any other Western country. You don't have a situation where they're struggling to get $14 an hour for minimum wage, and then you've got CEOs are making millions of dollars a year. The CEOs, as much as anything else, don't believe that's fair, and so they don't do it that way. This is probably not going to mean anything to you from where you're sitting, but you at least can see all these 1s, and then these 2s, and 3 and 4? Norway is rated number 1 in the following global indices. They are number 1 in the World Happiness Report, and have been almost every year for the last decade or so. Now think about this. They're in a country where it gets darn cold, and the nights are very long. All of these things, the whole SAD, the seasonal affective disorder that we get in the States, where when the days are short and the nights are long and it gets cold, they have to deal with that too, and yet still they are the world's happiest country. They are the world's #1 country 12 of the last 13 years in the World Development Index, meaning all of the characteristics of human development, education, availability of sanitation, various other kinds of necessary human services. They have been rated #1 12 of the last 13 years. They also rate #1 in the Inequality Adjusted World Development Index. In other words, for when you take into account even the lowest of their income groups, for instance, the Sami, or what we usually knew as Laplanders, although they don't use that expression anymore, in the very north, which are very, they live very much in the land, they don't have a lot of money. Even taking into account all of that kind of thing, they still are #1 in the World Development Index. They are #1 in the Better Life Index from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. They are #1 in the Index of Public Integrity. Remember, I told you that the people trust their government, and the government has proven themselves to be trustworthy. They're, as I said, #1 in the Democracy Index, #1 in the State of the World's Mothers. They are #1 in the Press Freedom Index and #1 in the Legatum Prosperity Index. All of those categories, they are rated #1 in the world. They slip a little bit on these next ones because they're only rated #2. That is the Gallup Gross Median Household Index, meaning their households, they make their average income is $77,000 a year. In the United States, it's $59,500. So they're significantly higher than the U.S. Their median equivalent adult income is the second in the world. Their International Property Rights Index is second in the world. Their Global Gender Gap Report, which means how fair is it between men and women, is second in the world. The Net International Investment Position of creditor nations is second in the world. They financially are very stable. Then they fall to third in the Health Consumer Index in Europe and the Corruption Perceptions Index in terms of how people perceive their government. They're only third in those. Okay? They are rated last in the list of failed states or potential failed states. What that means is they are rated the world's best functioning and most stable country, more than any other country in the world. They are less likely to have a collapse than any other country. The 70% of their workers are protected by union or other kinds of contracts. The assets in government wealth fund, basically the government reserves, are 331% of their annual GDP. That's compared to 25% in the United States. So they have, 331% of their annual budget they have in reserves. As I say, their GDP is significantly higher than the US per capita. They are always listed either #1 or #2 in the happiest countries. The United States is somewhere in the mid-teens in terms of the happiness index. Life expectancy in Norway is 81.7 years. That's compared to 79.7 years in the United States, and the US has been falling in recent years. People are dying younger rather than living longer overall. America's infant mortality rate is 3 times higher than Norway's. And America's murder rates and their incarceration rates, the percentage of people that get put in prison, are 10 times higher than Norway's. So 10 times more murders, 10 times more people put in prison. Do you begin to see why I titled this, Norway is the best country in the world?
Do they accept immigrants?
What's that? I'm sorry, what's that?
Do they accept immigrants?
Do they accept immigrants? I'm sure you could probably work something out. Most countries, if you have financial resources that you're not going to be a burden on the country, I don't even know if that's an issue for them. But in almost every way imaginable, human rights, the advocacy for minorities of various kinds, the quality of their prisons, the economic stability, the pay rate, the happiness, you name it. And they're #1, #2 on those kinds of indices. So it is quite extraordinary. They are a social democracy, which has become kind of a bad word. Like I say, people associate it with Venezuela or whatever, but this is a country where the people are very satisfied with the arrangement and the relationship that they have with their government. So the social part of it does not give them any heartburn. One other thing that I really like about the Norwegians is that they drink an average of 7.2 kilos of coffee per person per year. Now, Carol and I are from Seattle, and I actually calculated, because we buy our coffee by the kilo, we're considerably more than that. But then Seattle is a unique, we came from Seattle, we live in Mexico now. The only country in the world that on average drinks more coffee than the Norwegians are the caffeine-crazy Finns. In Finland, they drink even more than that. Have you seen the original versions of, like, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which is Sweden? This is all Scandinavian. Did you notice that every 3 minutes somebody's pouring a cup of coffee? Doesn't matter if it's 2 o'clock in the morning. They're drinking coffee, and they drink a lot of coffee here in the Northwest. But as I say, my wife and I drink probably double what they do here in Norway, and only the good stuff, espresso. And by the way, if you have not discovered the Yacht Club in the morning for really good coffee, got to go up there. They do good espresso. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. You've probably seen this in movies and TV shows. In fact, we saw a show just like a week ago where this was a key component of the plot. This is a secure seed storage that is located on Spitsbergen Island, which is part of the Svalbard archipelago. Remember, I showed you on the map. It's 810 miles from the North Pole, and here they maintain duplicate samples of seeds from gene banks around the world. The idea is if they ever have a catastrophe of some kind and they need to be able to replenish food supply or even other kinds of seeds, they have not just food seeds, they'd be able to do it. Now, around the world, there are 1,750 different seed banks that maintain seeds in various countries and regions. But for example, a number of years ago, the Philippines Seed Bank suffered from a flood and then a subsequent fire, was completely destroyed. The seed banks in Iraq and Afghanistan, for fairly obvious reasons, have been completely destroyed. Well, when those seed banks are destroyed, they have backups here, 810 miles from the North Pole, and they are able to access those in order to reestablish the diversity of seeds that they have available in their country. The actual construction, which is very cool and very dramatic, this goes 120 meters back into a sandstone mountain. This was chosen, this area, because it has very little tectonic activity, doesn't have earthquakes. It is set 430 feet above sea level, so they've estimated that at that point all of the ice in the Arctic could melt and they still wouldn't be underwater, so they took that into account. And while they have air conditioning there, they maintain a minus 18 degrees centigrade inside the building. It's cold enough, there's permafrost there, that they said if the air conditioning units completely went out, they would still take 2 centuries before it got up to freezing inside the building, to 0 degrees centigrade. So that's just the climate. All of the seeds that are in here are in heat-sealed tri-foil packets, which are then stored in plastic bins, which are stored in metal racks, so that it is all very secure. Now, this was built by the Norwegian government without outside funding. They started in 2006, and they make it available to any nations or any legitimate organizations that are seeking to try to maintain the seed diversity in the world without charge. You don't have to pay anything if you're a legitimate country or organization that has seeds that you want to store here. And the seeds are always yours. It's like a safety deposit box. Norway runs it along with an organization called the Crop Trust, but Norway paid for the building, and the stuff that you store there is yours. Your countries, your organizations. So they don't claim that they have a right to any of that stuff. The funding is both ongoing operating costs are paid both by Norway and also by this crop trust, and the funding comes from a number of countries that contribute to it, and also some organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a major supporter of this. And this is just to make sure that we don't have catastrophes that destroy our food crops. Yes?
What is the scale on the picture? The scale?
Well, it goes back into the mountain 120 meters, so it's not, I think these are doors, okay? So it's not a gigantic facility. It doesn't need to be. Seeds aren't that big. But the So 120 meters, we're looking at 400 feet, 500 feet back into the mountain. Right now they have 90,000 different food crop samples and a total of 400,000 different samples. That means different kinds, because they have other kinds of plants. I mean, you know, we could grow crops, but if we didn't have trees and things of that sort, then we wouldn't survive very long anyway. The total number of seeds they have is over 20 million in this facility. So, and they're maintained very careful conditions. They, for instance, have 32 varieties of potato, which is very important to me. I like potatoes. So, potatoes are important. Did you know that you can survive just on potatoes and water? Anyway, the 1/3 of all the world's food crops are represented in this facility. Now again, there's 1,750 other seed banks around the world. This is sort of the backup to those backups, but it is a very important facility. You'll notice this picture down here, for instance, you can sort of see the turquoise color. Norway's a cool country. Norway has a requirement, a law that says that anytime the government builds a facility over a certain value, they have to include artwork. How enlightened is that? And so what they did when they built this is they had a Norwegian artist named Diveki San create an artwork called Perpetual Repercussion that is along the front of it and then along the top. And it uses neon. It's supposed to represent the sky, Arctic sky, and the aurora borealis, you know, the northern lights. And so it uses neon and other things to kind of represent that. You get a little bit of that effect down there. So I just think that the idea that a government would make it a law that if they're going to spend a certain amount of money on a project, they have to have something artistic, something aesthetic about it, is just very cool. This vault has been voted the number 6 most important invention by Time Magazine, invention in the world, because of the fact that it is our guarantee for the future of humanity, if you will. And Norway built it with their own money, and they maintain it primarily with their own money, although they do get some other contributions. So again, very forward-thinking, very aware. You know, they're not just dealing with things day to day. The government of Norway seems to be very aware of what the long-term results of are, what they do. So, who wants to learn how to speak Norwegian? Does anybody know how to speak Norwegian? Phew, that's good, because my Norwegian's not very good. Basic Norwegian phrases. If you use 1 or 2 of these at the various stops we're going to go to, they'll be astonished. Now, they all speak English, by the way. In Scandinavia, everybody pretty much speaks English. When we were in Bergen last time, I asked one of the guides, you know, how many people, because everybody seemed to be speaking English to us, and I said, how many people speak English? And the guide said, everyone. It's required in school. So they all speak English. Again, how enlightened is that? Ja is yes. Nei is no. Nei. Vær så snill means please. Vær så snill. Tak is thank you. Now, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian are very similar. If you were in a restaurant in Copenhagen before you got on the boat, you may have heard somebody saying tak. That's thank you. That's the case in Danish as well as Norwegian. Tak. Vær så god. Vær så god is you're welcome. Undskyld means excuse me. Beklaget means I am sorry. God morgen, it's not Morgan, it's morgen. God morgen is good morning. And god kveld is good evening. Okay, everybody want to repeat those? No, I'm not going to make you do that. But this, if you just, you know, pick out 1 or 2 of these things and use them when you are at some of these ports, if you're in a shop or with a guide or whatever, and you'll be their hero. They will love that, because the fact is, in so many countries, they're accustomed to having to learn, well, they learn English anyway, but having to speak English, because there's the old story about somebody who speaks 3 languages. Have you heard this? Somebody who speaks 3 languages is trilingual. Somebody who speaks 2 languages is bilingual. Somebody who speaks 1 language is American. you know, Carolyn and I live in Mexico, and we're still not fluent in Spanish. So, etiquette for tourists in Norway. I think these are a pretty good idea for anywhere you go in the world, or even if you're on a cruise ship. The Norwegians are pretty relaxed. They're pretty easygoing. Remember, they're the happiest people in the world. What do they have to be worried about? And their behavior toward visitors is pretty much the same as other Western European countries. There are no really weird sort of customs. Like in Albania, where to say yes, you shake your head, and to say no, you nod your head. That's a weird one. But you run into those. There's nothing like that in Norway. It's very much a Western European country. There are some places where they have high immigrant populations, like in parts of Oslo, where they are much more conservative in terms of their dress and their language and that sort of thing. You need to be aware of that. In the rural areas, especially of Norway, they very much don't like loud or loutish behavior. Well, guest lecturers don't like loud or loutish behavior either, so I'm right there with them. But yeah, just, you know, they're a very laid-back people, and they don't like somebody who's really loud and really pushy and that kind of thing. But those should be truths that we accept anywhere we go. Yes?
Back to the language. A Norwegian word that ends in ER, for instance, the town that we're in.
Right.
Or Laos.
Stavanger.
Yes. How do you pronounce that?
Usually you kind of cut the R off, like Stavanger.
So it's like A.
You swallow it a little bit, yeah. I mean, the R is in there, but it's real Stavanger. Like ver, snil.
Okay.
The R is not emphasized. You know, it's there.
If it ends in an A. No?
I don't even know. I'd have to see a word and think about that. But for the most part, I mean, there are a few things that are different. Like this is an SH, sh,
Okay.
shashnil. They have accent marks that we don't use. So, there's vershako, and frequently you don't hit the last letter very hard. You know, and that's true with most of the Scandinavian languages. Yes?
Take the I am sorry. How would
Okay.
the ending of that?
That one, they almost make it a D. It's beklagen.
Okay.
Again, you know how sometimes in French and other languages you swallow the end of a word? That's a little bit true here. Instead of beklager, which is how we would pronounce it, beklager, it's beklagen, so that it almost ends sounding like a D rather than an R. Beklagen.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
I am not an expert on the Norwegian language. I hope I didn't just completely misguide you and cause you to offend somebody seriously at the next stop, okay? But hopefully these little expressions would be valuable to you. Other questions about any of this? Yes?
Well, I happened to travel into Norway when I was in my 20s and early 70s, and I was in Oslo, and I went into a bookstore, and I said, I noticed that most of the books are in English. And one of the salespeople said, well, there are only 4 million Norwegians, which is one of the things I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
There's no money in publishing books in Norwegian, or something like that.
Yeah.
I said, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
So there was almost some pressure to learn another language in order to be able to consume culture.
Right. Yeah, that's true. They're at about 5.3 million now, I think, is the latest estimate that I saw. But yeah, that's true. There's not a huge market. It's like Norwegian language, while it's similar to Danish and Swedish, it's different enough that if you print a book in Norwegian, you've got, at the most, 5.3 million people are going to buy it, you know. And so there's not a big market for it. Now, interestingly enough, all of Scandinavia are very much readers. They love books. In fact, Iceland is the world's largest producer of books and consumer of books. They read more books in Iceland than any other country in the world per capita. You know, people are reading all the time. Again, long winters, long nights, reading is a good thing. And so that you get a lot of that. I think that's true with the rest of Scandinavia as well. Yes?
So the second part was, you know, the growth in the population. Is that largely because of the relative prosperity of the country, the ability to support larger families?
So is the growth and prosperity because of the growth in population because of the growth and prosperity? Interestingly enough, more prosperous countries tend to have lower birth rates. You know, there's a direct correlation there, which is probably why they're not at 7 or 8 million. I mean, you know, Japan is struggling to maintain a population level to have workers. In almost every highly developed country, Japan, the US, etc., the birth rate is much lower than it is in developing countries. And so I think that a lot of it is you still have a lot of Norwegians that have traveled to the West. I mean, people love Norway. A lot of them stay there. It's not like they have a mass exodus or anything like that, but there still is an attraction to some place where, you know, it doesn't get quite so cold and dark. So, yeah, we get a lot of immigrants and have for a long, long time. Yes? I'm sorry. Their main tasks? Taxes. The tax rate is fairly high because it is a social democracy, but they don't complain about that. In fact, there have been times in the past when in various surveys, various polls where they have asked the people, would you be willing to give up some of the services the government offers you in return for reduced taxes? And the people have said no. We want to pay these taxes. We're willing to pay the taxes because we have free health care, we have free education, we have social services that are very positive. They trust the government. They don't have a fear that they're taking my money and doing something with it I'm not happy about. So they actually are happy to pay the taxes, and they feel like that would be because they're highly paid. They're very well paid. They feel like that's a good trade for them. That they don't have to worry about coming up with money for medical care and all the other kinds of things that countries with lower tax rates do, and they feel that that's a good trade-off for them. Yes?
Getting back to the point you said, Norway was very forward-looking.
Mm-hmm.
Since 25% of their GDP is based on fossil fuels, how are they about global warming and alternative energy?
Well, they're hugely ecologically concerned. As I say, they were the first country, major country that's involved in forestry that passed laws against deforestation, and they're coming up with very creative approaches to maintain the environment and ecology. The reality is that fossil fuels are still the dominant energy source in the world, and so they're taking advantage of that. But they also are pursuing natural gas. They're pursuing wind power. In fact, you may have seen that throughout Scandinavia, in Copenhagen, for instance, they had the turbines right there where the boat was parked as we were pulling out. And the same thing is true in much of Norway. They have a large amount of hydropower because you may have seen some of the waterfalls today. They have a lot of the mountains, the water flowing out of the mountains. They're doing a lot with hydropower. So while they are taking advantage of the fact that they have huge fossil fuel reserves in terms of oil and exporting it because there's a market for that, they also are very focused on trying to develop ecological solutions to energy needs and that sort of thing. So, any other questions?
Yeah, just one more.
Yeah.
On that, following up on that, does that mean that the protections on drilling and the safety backups are more sort of ambitious than maybe other countries do with their oil production?
So are the safety and backup and that sort of thing more focused than other countries or more intentional? I don't know that level of detail, to be quite honest with you, about the petro industry. I do know that they are, like Stavanger, where we just were, they are major, a lot of what they do are building oil platforms and things of that sort for sale to other countries and in other regions. They're doing a lot in the North Sea, but beyond that, I really couldn't speak to their concern. Knowing their focus in so many other areas of concern for human welfare as well as for ecological welfare, I imagine that's probably a pretty big issue for them, that they are concerned about safety and they're concerned about making sure that things are ecologically sound when they produce them. Yes?
Well, I know today over at the museum, they had one catastrophe, I don't know how many years ago it was, and I asked there's a tour guide there, and he said they haven't had any catastrophes since, and I don't remember the date, but it was
Right.
quite some time ago.
Okay.
They said they've had evacuations, but no tragedies, no catastrophes, because of their concern about all the safety.
Right. So she's saying the Petroleum Museum, they said there that they had one oil platform catastrophe a long time ago, and since then they have had no serious problems. And the assumption is that it's because they've been very concerned about safety and ecological controls and things of that sort. Any other questions? Well, I hope this gives you a sense of Norway, and that your enjoyment of Norway will be all that greater as we travel up and then back down the coast. It is quite an extraordinary country in a lot of ways, and has come very, very far. The next talk that I do is going to be a brief history of Scandinavia, where I'll be talking a little more about the history. I didn't get into the history today intentionally, because I'll talk about the history of Norway, of Sweden, and Denmark, and it's very confusing. Because Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, especially those three, and Finland sort of gets dragged into it between Sweden and Russia. They have gone back and forth. Denmark's in charge over Norway, and then over Sweden, and then Sweden's in charge over the other two, and then Denmark breaks free, and it's back and forth. It's a wonder that there have been huge moves, Scandinavism, to try to get them all as one country. At least Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, because they almost share a language. They're considered mutually intelligible Norse languages, meaning they're not exactly the same, but you usually can understand somebody speaking one of the others. Finnish is a completely different creature. It comes from Eastern Europe, and eventually, prior to that, even Central Asia. Finnish and Hungarian are closer together than Finnish and any of the other Scandinavian languages. And if any of you all know, Hungarian is considered the most difficult language in the world to learn. I mean, there's no cognates, there's no anything, and Finnish is very much like that. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Tomorrow we will have the talk on Scandinavia at 4 o'clock. So if you get back from your visiting in Flan, come on back and we'll have another talk. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.